I'm Edward, and it's lovely to be spending this quiet time together. Tonight, a warm greeting to our listeners in South Carolina. Let us know where you're listening from, and do you enjoy going for walks? Please subscribe if you enjoy these cozy mysteries. Now, settle in, and let us begin. Chapter 1. The evening everyone took for granted. November had settled upon St. Mary Mead with that particular quality of inevitability that belongs to the turning of seasons in small English villages. The days had grown noticeably shorter, and by 4:30 the light had already begun to fade, casting long shadows across the high street, and giving the warm glow of cottage windows a reassuring prominence against the gathering dusk. It was not an unpleasant time of year, Miss Marple reflected, as she sat in her customary chair by the sitting-room window, her knitting needles moving with their usual gentle rhythm. The summer visitors had long since departed, the autumn harvest had been gathered in, and the village had returned to that comfortable pattern of life which required no particular explanation to those who lived it. There was something deeply satisfying about the predictability of November in St. Mary Mead, though Miss Marple, being a woman of considerable observation, was always aware that predictability could sometimes blind one to the most significant details. The bus from Much Benham arrived each evening at 5:20, depositing its small collection of passengers at the stop near the corner of the high street. Most of them were familiar faces, people whose routines Miss Marple had long since catalogued in that methodical way she had of understanding the life around her. There was young Mrs. Henderson, who worked 3 days a week at the draper's in town. There was Mr. Coombs from the farm, who went in on Wednesdays for the cattle market, and there was Mr. Arthur Lennox, who made the journey to Much Benham every Tuesday and Friday afternoon without fail. Mr. Lennox was a man of perhaps 72 or 73 years, though he carried himself with the erect posture of someone considerably younger. He had lived in St. Mary Mead for nearly 15 years, occupying a small but well-maintained cottage at the far end of Marsh Lane, beyond the church and past the point where most of the village's social activity naturally concluded. He was not a native of the village, having arrived from somewhere in the north following his retirement from some manner of clerical work, though the exact details of his previous life were not widely known. This was not unusual in itself. Many people came to St. Mary Mead seeking a quiet retirement, and the village was generally willing to allow them their privacy, provided they conducted themselves with appropriate courtesy and caused no particular trouble. Mr. Lennox fulfilled both requirements admirably. He was invariably polite, paid his bills promptly, attended church with reasonable regularity, and maintained his cottage and garden to a standard that gave no cause for complaint. He was not, however, what one might call a sociable man. He exchanged pleasantries when necessary, contributed to collections for various charitable causes, and could be relied upon to make appropriate remarks about the weather or the state of the vicar's roses, but he did not invite intimacy. There was a quality of distance about him, a sense that while he lived among the people of St. Mary Mead, he did not quite live with them. His twice-weekly visits to Much Benham had begun some 3 years previously, shortly after the village library had been closed as an economy measure by the local council. Much Benham possessed a considerably larger library, and Mr. Lennox, it appeared, was a devoted reader. He would catch the 3:30 bus, spend an hour or so browsing and borrowing, and return on the 5:20 service. From the bus stop to his cottage was a walk of perhaps 20 minutes, following the curve of the high street, past the church and along the quiet stretch of Marsh Lane, until one reached his gate. He always walked. This had become a point of some discussion in the village, particularly during the winter months when darkness fell early and the weather could be decidedly unpleasant. Mrs. Price, who kept the post office and general shop, had more than once offered him a lift in her nephew's motor car. Colonel Melchett, who lived at the Old Hall and took a benevolent interest in the welfare of elderly residents, had suggested on several occasions that Mr. Lennox might care to join him for the return journey, as their paths often coincided. Even Miss Marple herself had once or twice extended the offer of her nephew Raymond's car when he happened to be visiting. Mr. Lennox refused all such offers with unfailing courtesy. He preferred to walk, he explained, It was good for his constitution. He enjoyed the evening air. He had no objection whatsoever to a bit of weather. His tone was always pleasant but quite final, and after a while people had ceased to press the matter. If Mr. Lennox wished to walk, that was his affair. He was clearly a man of settled habits, and there was a general feeling in the village that one should respect such determination in a person of his years. Miss Marple had observed this pattern with the interest she brought to all aspects of village life. It was not that she disapproved of Mr. Lennox's independence, but she could not help noticing how readily the village had accepted it. There was something almost too convenient about the way everyone had agreed that his preference for walking was admirable, even commendable. It required nothing of anyone else, you see. It made no demands. Mr. Lennox's independence was the sort that caused no inconvenience to his neighbours, and Miss Marple had lived long enough to understand that such independence was far more likely to be praised than the sort that required assistance or accommodation. She had also noticed, though she could not have said precisely when the observation had first formed itself in her mind, that Mr. Lennox's route home took him along a stretch of road that was often quite deserted at that hour. Marsh Lane, particularly the portion beyond the church, saw very little traffic in the evening. Most people had no reason to venture in that direction after dark. It was a peaceful walk, certainly, but also a solitary one. This evening, as Miss Marple's needles clicked gently and the light faded beyond her window, she could just make out the figure of Mr. Lennox descending from the bus at his usual time. He stood for a moment at the stop, adjusting his hat and the collar of his overcoat, then set off at his customary measured pace along the high street. He carried a small parcel under one arm, doubtless containing his borrowed books, and walked with that deliberate, careful tread that characterized elderly gentlemen who have made up their minds not to hurry. Mrs. Pollock, who lived in the cottage opposite and whose capacity for observation was exceeded only by her enthusiasm for sharing it, happened to be returning from the butcher's at that moment. She nodded to Mr. Lennox, and he touched his hat in response. A perfectly ordinary exchange, Miss Marple noted, everything proceeding as it always did. She continued with her knitting, but a small corner of her mind remained attuned to the scene outside. It was curious, really, how villages worked. There was Mr. Lennox walking home in the gathering darkness, and there was the entire village agreeing that this was perfectly natural, perfectly sensible, perfectly like him. No one worried, no one watched, no one, Miss Marple suspected, even thought about him much once he had passed from view. It reminded her, in a vague way, of something that had happened many years ago in St. Mary Mead. Old Mrs. Hargreaves, who had lived alone at the end of Church Lane, had been in the habit of taking an evening stroll to settle her digestion. Everyone had known about it, everyone had approved of it, and everyone had been rather horrified when she had been found one morning having suffered a fall the previous evening. She had lain there for hours, it transpired, on a quiet stretch of path where no one had any particular reason to pass. The village had been full of regret and sympathy, but Miss Marple had not been able to shake the feeling that the regret would have been better placed before the incident rather than after it. Of course, Mr. Lennox was younger than Mrs. Hargreaves had been, and considerably more robust. There was no reason to suppose that anything untoward might happen to him. And yet, Miss Marple thought, there was something about the way the village had embraced his independence that made her just a little uneasy. It was too comfortable, too convenient. It asked nothing of anyone. She glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. 5:30. Mr. Lennox would be well along the high street by now, perhaps just passing the churchyard wall. In another quarter of an hour he would be safely home, his kettle on for tea, his books laid out ready for the evening's reading. Miss Marple returned her attention to her knitting. It was a pullover for her great-nephew, and the pattern required concentration. Still, as her needles moved and the wool slipped through her practised fingers, she found herself thinking about walks that were taken alone, about habits that were approved because they required no involvement, and about the way a village could sometimes mistake distance for respect. Outside, the darkness deepened, and the lights of St. Mary Mead glowed warmly against the November night. Everything was as it should be. Everything was perfectly ordinary. And that, Miss Marple reflected with a slight frown, was precisely what made her feel that something somewhere might not be quite right at all. Chapter 2. A Body Found Where No One Waited. The news reached Miss Marple shortly after 9 o'clock the following morning, delivered by Miss Hartnell, who had heard it from her daily woman, who had heard it from the milkman, who had been told by young Tom Bates when he arrived to help with the morning delivery. Tom Bates, it transpired, had been the one to find him. Miss Hartnell was a woman of considerable energy and uncertain tact, qualities that made her an efficient distributor of village information, though not always a welcome one. She arrived at Miss Marple's gate slightly out of breath, her hat askew and her manner suggesting that she carried intelligence of some importance. "My dear Miss Marple," she began, before she had quite reached the front door, "the most dreadful thing has happened. Mr. Lennox has been found dead." Miss Marple, who had been considering the advisability of pruning her late roses, set down her gardening gloves with deliberate care. "Mr. Lennox," she said quietly. "Are you quite certain?" "Perfectly certain. Tom Bates discovered him not an hour ago, sitting on that old stone wall near the Orchard Road. You know the place, just where the path curves before reaching Marsh Lane. Tom was taking a shortcut across the field to deliver eggs to Mrs. Fletcher when he saw him there." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her fingers, resting now against the garden gate, tightened slightly. "How very distressing for Tom," she said, "and for everyone, naturally. Was Dr. Haydock sent for?" "Immediately. He's there now, or was when my Mrs. Bridges heard about it. Of course, there's nothing to be done. The poor man must have passed away during the evening. Dr. Haydock believes it was his heart." Miss Marple absorbed this information in silence. The Orchard Road was not, strictly speaking, on the direct route from the bus stop to Mr. Lennox's cottage. It was possible to reach Marsh Lane that way, certainly by taking the footpath that skirted the old Grayson property, but it added several minutes to the journey and involved navigating a stile and an uneven stretch of ground that most elderly people would have considered inadvisable after dark. "I see," said Miss Marple at length. "That is very sad indeed. Had Mr. Lennox been unwell, do you know?" "Not that anyone was aware of, though of course at his age one never can tell. Dr. Haydock will know more, I'm sure, but the village is quite shocked, as you can imagine. Such a sudden thing." Miss Marple invited Miss Hartnell inside for a cup of tea, an offer that was accepted with alacrity. Over the next 20 minutes, as they sat into the morning room and Miss Marple poured from her second-best china, the details emerged in a more orderly fashion. Tom Bates, who was a sensible young man of about 19, had been crossing the field at approximately 8:15 that morning. The old Orchard Road was no longer much used since the Grayson property had been sold and the new owners had closed off the main entrance, but the footpath remained a public right-of-way. It was a clear, cold morning, and Tom had noticed the figure on the wall from some distance away. At first, he had assumed it was someone resting, but as he drew closer, something about the absolute stillness of the posture had alarmed him. Mr. Whodunit Lennox was seated on the low stone wall that marked the boundary of what had once been the orchard. He was facing toward the village, though his eyes were closed. His hat lay beside him on the wall, placed with care. His hands rested in his lap, one upon the other. Tom, who had sufficient presence of mind not to touch anything, had run immediately to the nearest cottage and raised the alarm. Dr. Haydock had arrived within 15 minutes, examined the body, and pronounced life extinct. He had ventured the opinion, subject to a more thorough examination later, that Mr. Lennox had suffered a cardiac event and had died quickly, possibly, without any great discomfort. There were no signs of injury, no indication of distress. Everything, the doctor observed, suggested a peaceful passing. "He must have felt unwell and sat down to rest," Miss Hartnell concluded, setting down her teacup with an air of finality. "It's a perfectly sensible thing to have done, really. Better than trying to struggle on and perhaps collapsing in the road. At least he found somewhere to sit." Miss Marple made a small sound of agreement, though her gaze had turned toward the window and the grey November sky beyond. "Yes," she said softly, "a sensible spot to rest." After Miss Hartnell had departed, armed with sufficient information to continue her circuit of the village, Miss Marple remained in her chair for some time, her hands folded in her lap in an attitude not unlike the one Tom Bates had described. The word rest had been used several times during Miss Hartnell's account, and each time it had struck Miss Marple as oddly deliberate, though the choice of word mattered a great deal. She thought about Mr. Lennox, that courteous, self-contained man who had walked alone through the November darkness, and had, at some point during that walk, found himself unable to continue, or had chosen not to continue, or had been persuaded somehow that continuing was unnecessary. No, that was foolish. Miss Marple checked herself firmly. There was no reason to suppose anything other than what de Haydock had concluded. An elderly man walking in the cold evening air after what was probably a tiring day had felt the warning signs of heart trouble and had sat down to rest. He had died peacefully. It was sad, certainly, but not mysterious, not suspicious. And yet the Orchard Road troubled her. Why had Mr. Lennox chosen that route? He was a man of fixed habits, and his habit had been to walk along the High Street and up Marsh Lane directly to his cottage. The footpath past the old orchard added time and difficulty to the journey, and offered no particular advantage except perhaps a degree of privacy. But Mr. Lennox had never seemed to seek privacy for its own sake. He simply had not sought company. There was a difference. By midday, the village had absorbed the news with that mixture of shock and philosophical acceptance that characterises communities where death, though regretted, is understood to be a natural conclusion to life. The vicar called upon Miss Marple briefly to discuss arrangements, as Mr. Lennox had no known family, and someone would need to organise matters. Miss Marple suggested that Colonel Melchett might be the appropriate person to coordinate such things, and the vicar agreed gratefully. In the afternoon, Miss Marple walked down to the village, ostensibly to purchase wool from Mrs. Price's shop, but in reality to observe the mood and gather what additional information might be circulating. She was not disappointed. Mrs. Price, Mrs. Pollock, and Mrs. Henderson were all present, and the conversation naturally centred upon the morning's discovery. "Such a shock for young Tom," Mrs. Price was saying as Miss Marple entered, "though I must say he handled it very well. Not everyone would have had the sense to fetch help immediately rather than standing about in a panic." "A dreadful thing to come upon," Mrs. Henderson agreed. She was a thin, anxious woman who worked in much Benham, and always seemed faintly worried about something. Though I suppose if one must die, sitting peacefully on a stone wall is not the worst way to go about it. "Better than being found in a ditch," Mrs. Pollock observed with characteristic bluntness. "At least he had the presence of mind to sit down properly. Shows he knew what was happening, I should think." Miss Marple selected a skein of pale blue wool and brought it to the counter. "It was fortunate that Tom found him when he did," she remarked. "I understand the Orchard Road is not much travelled these days. Hardly ever, Mrs. Price confirmed. Not since the Grayson sold up. Most people keep to the main roads now. I can't think what Mr. Lennox was doing out that way, to be perfectly honest. It's not as though it's a shortcut to anywhere in particular. Perhaps he felt unwell and simply sat down at the nearest available spot," Mrs. Henderson suggested. "When one's heart is failing, I don't suppose one thinks very clearly about routes and such." "No doubt you're right," Miss Marple said gently. She paid for the wool and exchanged a few more pleasantries before making her way home, but her mind was occupied with the image of Mr. Lennox, seated on that wall in the darkness, his hat placed carefully beside him. That evening, as she sat once more by her window with her knitting, Miss Marple found herself returning again and again to the scene as it had been described to her. Everything about it suggested composure, orderliness, even a kind of peaceful acceptance. Mr. Lennox had not collapsed. He had not fallen. He had sat down, removed his hat, and arranged himself as one might before settling in for a rest. But it had not been a rest. It had been a death. And the village, she noticed, had already begun to speak of it as though the two were the same thing. A peaceful end, a sensible place to stop. No distress, no struggle, no cause for particular concern beyond the natural sorrow of losing a neighbour. Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. She thought of Mrs. Hargreaves again, that elderly lady who had taken her evening walks and had fallen alone on a quiet path where no one passed. The village had mourned her, had spoken with regret about not having checked on her, had wished that someone had thought to make certain she returned home safely, and yet with Mr. Lennox there was no such regret. There was only acceptance. He had sat down to rest, and death had found him there, and everyone agreed that it was the sort of thing that happened to elderly gentlemen who walked alone on air. November evenings, the word rest continued to echo in Miss Marple's mind. It was such a gentle word, such a comfortable word. It implied choice and peace and natural conclusion. It did not invite questions or investigation or doubt, which was precisely, Miss Marple thought as she resumed her knitting, why it had been chosen quite so carefully by quite so many people in quite so short a time. Outside, the November darkness had fallen once more over St. Mary Mead, and the lights of the village glowed warm and steady. Everything was as it should be. Everything was perfectly explained. And yet Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that Mr. Lennox's last walk home had ended, not where he had intended, but where someone else had decided it should. Chapter 3. Sympathy Measured by Distance. The funeral was held on a grey Thursday afternoon, 4 days after Tom Bates had made his discovery. The weather had turned properly cold by then, with a sharp wind that rattled the bare branches of the churchyard elms and sent fallen leaves skittering across the path. It was the sort of day that made one grateful for warm coats and the prospect of tea by the fire afterward. Miss Marple arrived a few minutes before the service was due to begin, timing her entrance with the precision that came from long familiarity with village occasions. Too early, and one risked appearing over-eager or intrusive. Too late, and one seemed disrespectful. The correct moment was when the church was perhaps 2/3 full, but not yet so crowded that one's arrival would be noted with particular attention. She took her usual place in the third pew from the front on the left-hand side, a position that afforded a clear view of both the altar and, by means of a slight turn of the head, most of the congregation. It was a habit formed over many years of observing human nature in its various manifestations, and Miss Marple had long since ceased to question whether such observation was entirely appropriate during religious services. God, she felt certain, understood the importance of paying attention. The attendance was respectable without being remarkable. Colonel Melchett was present naturally, having taken charge of the arrangements with his characteristic efficiency. Dr. Haydock sat near the back, his weathered face composed in suitable solemnity. Mrs. Price had closed the shop for the afternoon and occupied a pew near the middle with her sister. The vicar's wife was there, and Miss Hartnell, and most of the other familiar faces that constituted what might be called the social core of St. Mary Mead. What struck Miss Marple, however, was not who had come, but the manner in which they had come. There was a certain quality to the gathering, a sort of dutiful politeness that suggested obligation rather than grief. People nodded to one another with appropriate gravity. They spoke in lowered voices. They demonstrated all the correct forms of mourning, and yet there was an unmistakable sense of distance about the whole affair, as though they had come to pay respects to someone they knew of rather than someone they knew. The service itself was brief and dignified. The vicar, Mr. Clement, spoke well as he generally did, touching upon themes of mortality, the comfort of faith, and the hope of resurrection. He mentioned Mr. Lennox's reliability, his courtesy, his many years as a resident of St. Mary Mead. He did not, Miss Marple noticed, mention anything personal about the man. There were no anecdotes, no particular memories, no small human details that might have brought the deceased more vividly to mind. It was the sort of eulogy one might deliver for any reasonably blameless person about whom one knew very little. Afterward, as the small gathering moved outside into the cold wind for the interment, Miss Marple found herself beside Mrs. Henderson, who was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Such a sad occasion," Mrs. Henderson murmured. "One always hopes for a longer life for people, doesn't one?" Mr. Lennox was 73, I believe, Miss Marple said gently. "Not so very young, though certainly not ancient either." "No, I suppose not. Still, it seems dreadful to die alone like that in the dark. I do hope he wasn't frightened." "Dr. Haydock believes it would have been very quick," Miss Marple offered. "That is some comfort, at least." Mrs. Henderson nodded and fell silent, and Miss Marple was left to reflect upon the curious nature of the sentiment that had just been expressed. Mrs. Henderson had lived in St. Mary Mead for 8 years, and during that time she must have passed Mr. Lennox on the street dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. Yet she spoke of him as one might speak of a stranger, glimpsed briefly at a railway station, with general compassion certainly, but without any personal connection. The gathering dispersed quite quickly once the committal was complete. There was no reception, no general assembly for tea and sandwiches. Colonel Melchett had made inquiries about such arrangements, but as there was no family to host or attend such an event, and as Mr. Lennox had not been the sort of man who inspired spontaneous gatherings, the idea had been quietly abandoned. People offered their final murmured condolences to no one in particular, and made their way home, relieved perhaps to have discharged their duty. Miss Marple walked back slowly, taking the path through the churchyard that led past the newer graves and toward the gate near Marsh Lane. She paused briefly at the freshly turned earth of Mr. Lennox's plot, noting the single wreath that Colonel Melchett had ordered on behalf of the village. The card attached bore the words "in remembrance" and nothing more. She was about to continue on when she became aware of another presence nearby. Mrs. Pauline Greer was standing a short distance away, also gazing toward the grave, her expression thoughtful. Mrs. Greer was a widow of perhaps 55, handsome rather than pretty, with grey-streaked dark hair and the sort of capable bearing that inspired confidence in organisational matters, who had lived in St. Mary Mead for 7 or 8 years and had quickly established herself as someone upon whom others could rely in practical situations. She was on the committee for the church fete, helped coordinate the Women's Institute meetings, and could always be counted upon to take charge when something needed doing. She was not warm precisely, but she was undeniably efficient and generally well regarded. "A sad business," Mrs. Greer said quietly, acknowledging Miss Marple's presence with a slight nod. "Very sad indeed," Miss Marple agreed. She moved a little closer, her walking stick making small indentations in the damp grass. "Did you know Mr. Lennox well, Mrs. Greer?" Mrs. Greer considered this for a moment. "As well as anyone did, I suppose, which is to say not terribly well. He was a private person, wasn't he? One respected that." "Yes, one did," Miss Marple said. "Though I've been thinking since his death how little any of us actually knew about him. Where he came from, what his life had been like before he retired here. One realises, rather too late, that one never asked." "I'm not sure he would have welcomed such questions," Mrs. Greer observed. Her tone was mild, but there was a firmness beneath it. "Some people prefer to leave the past in the past, Miss Marple. It's not always kindness to pry." "No, indeed. Though I wonder sometimes if our restraint is as much for our own convenience as for the privacy of others." Mrs. Greer's eyes, which were a pale grey and rather cool in their expression, met Miss Marple's briefly. "I'm not sure I take your meaning, or—" "Oh, only that it's easier, isn't it, not to become too involved in other people's concerns. One can maintain a polite distance and call it respect, when in truth it's simply less trouble that way." There was a short silence. Mrs. Greer's expression did not change precisely, but something in her posture stiffened slightly. "I think that's rather unfair, Miss Marple. We all have our own lives to manage. One cannot be intimately acquainted with every person in the village." "No, of course not," Miss Marple said at once, her tone apologetic. "Forgive me. I'm afraid I've been rather melancholy since Mr. Lennox's death. Makes one reflective, doesn't it, when someone passes away like that? One begins to wonder what might have been done differently." Mrs. Greer relaxed fractionally. "I don't think anyone could have done anything differently, Miss Marple. Mr. Lennox lived exactly as he chose to live. If he wanted company or assistance, he had only to ask for it. He chose not to, and that was his prerogative." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Yes, I suppose it was." They parted shortly afterward, Mrs. Greer making her way toward the village, and Miss Marple continuing more slowly in the direction of her cottage. But as she walked, Miss Marple found herself turning over Mrs. Greer's words in her mind. There had been something almost defensive in the way she had spoken, as though Miss Marple's mild observation had touched upon something uncomfortable. That evening Miss Marple received a visit from Colonel Melchett, who had come to report on the practical matters that had needed attending to following Mr. Lennox's death. The Colonel was a solid, dependable man with a military bearing and a genuine concern for the welfare of those he considered to be under his unofficial protection, which included most of the village's elderly residents. "Straightforward enough, really," he said, accepting the cup of tea Miss Marple had poured for him. Lennox left everything in good order. His solicitor in Much Benham had all the papers, will, instructions for the funeral, that sort of thing. No family to notify, which makes it simpler in some ways and sadder in others. "No family at all?" Miss Marple asked. "Apparently not. There was a wife many years ago, but she died. No children. He left the cottage and his modest savings to a charity that supports retired clerks. Very proper, very tidy. Everything arranged exactly as it should be." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "He sounds like a man who preferred to have matters settled." "Indeed. Can't fault him for that. Too many people leave chaos behind them. Lennox wasn't that sort." "Did his solicitor mention anything about Lennox's state of mind recently? Whether he had been concerned about his health, for instance?" Colonel Melchett shook his head. "Nothing of that nature. The will was drawn up several years ago, apparently. No recent changes or additions. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no particular reason. I was simply curious." The Colonel departed after finishing his tea, and Miss Marple was left alone with her thoughts. She picked up her knitting, but for once the familiar rhythm of the needles did not bring its usual sense of peaceful occupation. Her mind kept returning to the funeral, to the careful distance everyone had maintained, to the way Mr. Lennox had been described in terms that were universally polite and universally vague. Pleasant, reliable, private. These were the words the village had settled upon, and they would, Miss Marple suspected, be the words that persisted in memory. Not because they were untrue exactly, but because they required nothing more. They were safe words, comfortable words. They described a man who had made no demands upon his neighbours and who had, as Mrs. Greer had so firmly stated, lived exactly as he chose to live. But Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing how people transform themselves in the eyes of others, understood that sometimes distance became not just a characteristic of a person, but the only characteristic anyone could remember. And once that distance was accepted, once it became part of how someone was understood, it was remarkably easy to let them remain at that distance, even when, perhaps, they would have welcomed something different. She thought of Mrs. Greer standing by the grave, looking down at the turned earth. There had been something in her expression, something Miss Marple could not quite identify. Not grief, certainly, not guilt either, at least not of the obvious sort, but something, a sense of responsibility perhaps, or of duty fulfilled, or of a conclusion reached. Miss Marple set down her knitting and gazed out at the darkening evening. Mr. Lennox had been buried that afternoon, and the village had performed its obligations with proper decorum. The sympathy had been real enough in its way, but it had been the sympathy one extends to someone whose passing creates no particular absence, no disruption to the ordinary flow of life. And that, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps the saddest thing of all. Chapter 4, The Story That Spread Before Breakfast. By the morning following the funeral, the narrative had settled into place with remarkable speed. Miss Marple, making her way to the post office to collect a parcel that had been held for her, heard it repeated no fewer than 3 times in the space of a quarter hour, each iteration almost identical to the last. Poor Mr. Lennox must have felt his heart giving out and had the good sense to sit down. Fortunate, really, that he found that wall. Better than collapsing in the road. At least he went peacefully. Dr. Haydock said there would have been no suffering. The words had taken on a practised quality, as though they had been rehearsed in private and were now being performed for public consumption. Miss Marple found this phenomenon interesting. She had observed it before in village life, the way a story could be shaped and smoothed in the telling, until it acquired a sort of unofficial authority, becoming not just version of events, but the version, the one that required no further examination. Mrs. Price, when Miss Marple entered the shop, was in the midst of relaying the account to a customer from the neighbouring village of Little Stretton, and Mrs. Carstairs, who had come in for stamps and stayed for information. "Yes, my dear, it was quite sudden, but very peaceful," Mrs. Price was saying. "He was walking home from the bus, felt unwell, and sat down on a convenient wall. His heart simply gave out. At his age, these things happen. Dr. Haydock says he probably didn't suffer at all." Mrs. Carstairs made appropriately sympathetic noises. "How dreadful for the village. Though, as you say, at least it was peaceful. It could have been so much worse." "Indeed it could. If he'd been found in some unfortunate position, or if there had been any signs of distress. But no, he was sitting quite properly, hat beside him, perfectly composed, just as though he'd decided to rest for a moment." Miss Marple collected her parcel, a book she had ordered from London, and exchanged a few pleasantries with Mrs. Price before making her way back outside. The morning was bright and cold, with a pale sun that provided more light than warmth. She walked slowly, in no particular hurry, allowing her mind to turn over what she had just heard. The story was compelling in its simplicity. An elderly man walking alone on a November evening feels the warning signs of heart failure and sensibly sits down to rest. Death comes quickly and without drama. It was the sort of death that people described as a blessing, particularly for someone of advanced years who lived alone and had no family to mourn them in any profound way. And yet certain details troubled Miss Marple, small inconsistencies that seemed to catch in her mind like burrs in wool. She had known Mr. Lennox by sight for 15 years, had observed his habits with the attention she brought to all aspects of village life, and in all that time, she could not recall ever seeing him pause during his walks. He moved with deliberation, certainly, taking his time and proceeding at a measured pace appropriate to his age. But he did not stop. He did not rest. He walked from one point to another with the steady purposefulness of someone who had calculated exactly how long the journey should take and saw no reason to deviate from that calculation. Moreover, Mr. Lennox had struck her as a man who valued privacy not for its own sake but as a means of maintaining dignity. He did not invite attention. He did not make a spectacle of himself. And sitting on a stone wall beside a footpath, even one that was little used, was precisely the sort of public display that Miss Marple suspected he would have found deeply uncomfortable. If Mr. Lennox had felt unwell, would he not have attempted to reach his cottage, which was no more than 10 minutes further walk? Or if the distress had been too severe for that, would he not have sought shelter in a more private location, out of view of anyone who might pass by? The stone wall near the old orchard was visible from the path, visible from the field beyond. It was not a place where one could suffer a medical emergency without the possibility of being observed. And yet that was where he had been found, seated with apparent composure, his hat placed beside him as though he had all the time in the world. Miss Marple's route home took her past the vicarage, and she was not entirely surprised to encounter Mr. Clement emerging from his gate, a bundle of parish notices under his arm. The vicar was a thoughtful man in his early 50s, earnest and well-meaning, though perhaps not as observant of human nature as his position might have required. "Good morning, Miss Marple, ma," he said, touching his hat. "A fine day, though cold." "Indeed, Mr. Clement. I trust you are well?" "Quite well, thank you. I've been thinking about Mr. Lennox's funeral yesterday. I hope it struck the right note. It's difficult, you know, when one doesn't have a great deal of personal information to draw upon." "You managed admirably," Miss Marple assured him. "These situations are never easy." The vicar fell into step beside her, and they walked together for a few moments in companionable silence. Then he said, with the air of someone who's been pondering a matter, "I must confess, Miss Marple, I've been feeling rather guilty since Mr. Lennox's death. I saw him, you know, on the afternoon before he died." Miss Marple's attention sharpened, though her expression remained mild. "Did you indeed?" "Yes, I encountered him in Much Benham, quite by chance. I'd been to visit a parishioner in the hospital there, and I saw Mr. Lennox coming out of the library. We exchanged a few words, nothing of any significance, just pleasantries about the weather and so forth. But what troubles me is that I thought he seemed, not unwell exactly, but perhaps preoccupied. a bit distracted, and I didn't. Inquire further. I simply wished him a good evening and went on my way. I'm sure there was nothing more you could have done, Miss Marple said gently. One cannot know when such a casual encounter might be the last. No, I suppose not. Still one wonders. If I had been more observant, more pastoral in my attention, might I have noticed something that would have made a difference? Did Mr. Lennox mention feeling unwell? Not at all. In fact, he said he was perfectly well, just occupied with some personal matters. I believe he said he had errands to complete. But there was something in his manner. I can't quite describe it. A sort of determination, perhaps, as though he had made a decision about something and was resolved to see it through. This was interesting. Miss Marple filed it away carefully. Determination can be a very natural response to the concerns of daily life, she observed. Perhaps he had simply decided to attend to matters that had been weighing on his mind. Perhaps, the vicar agreed, though he sounded unconvinced. Still, I find myself wishing I'd paid more attention. They parted at the corner where the vicar needed to turn toward the church, and Miss Marple continued homeward, her thoughts occupied with this new piece of information. Mr. Lennox had been preoccupied that afternoon, had mentioned errands and personal matters, and yet the village narrative insisted that his walk home had been entirely routine, that nothing unusual had occurred until his heart had simply given out. When she reached her cottage, Miss Marple found Miss Hartnell waiting on the doorstep, vibrating with the barely contained energy that characterized her arrivals. "My dear Miss Marple, I was hoping to catch you. I've just heard the most interesting thing from Mrs. Fletcher. You know, she lives at the end of the Orchard Road, near where poor Mr. Lennox was found." "Yes, I know Mrs. Fletcher," Miss Marple said, unlocking her door and gesturing for Miss Hartnell to enter. "What has she told you?" "Well, she says that on the evening Mr. Lennox died, she heard voices on the footpath. She didn't think anything of it at the time, of course, but now she's wondering whether one of them might have been Mr. Lennox." Miss Marple led the way into the sitting room and invited Miss Hartnell to take a seat. "Voices? More than one person, then?" "That's what she said, 2 people talking, though she couldn't make out the words. She was inside with the windows closed, you see, and it was some distance away, but she's quite certain there were 2 voices, and that one of them was a woman's." "How very interesting," Miss Marple said quietly. "Did Mrs. Fletcher mention what time this was?" "Shortly after 6, she thinks. She was preparing supper and happened to notice the time." Shortly after 6. That would have been approximately 40 minutes after the bus from Much Benham arrived. Time enough for Mr. Lennox to have walked to the Orchard Road, time enough for a conversation to take place, time enough for whatever had happened next to unfold. After Miss Hartnell had departed, energized by having delivered significant information, Miss Marple sat for a long time in her chair by the window, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The story that the village had embraced, the peaceful, solitary death of an elderly man who had simply sat down to rest, was beginning to show cracks. Small ones, certainly, but cracks nonetheless. Mr. Lennox had been preoccupied that afternoon. He had mentioned errands and personal matters. He had been heard talking with someone, a woman, near the place where he would later be found dead. And yet the narrative persisted, smooth and comfortable, requiring no investigation, no questions, no uncomfortable revelations. Miss Marple thought about how stories worked in villages, how they could be shaped by repetition until they became not just believable but inevitable. She thought about how convenient it was when a death required no explanation beyond the natural failure of an aging body. She thought about the word rest and how carefully it had been chosen by how many people in how short a time. And she thought about Mrs. Greer standing by the grave with that odd expression on her face, that sense of responsibility or duty fulfilled or conclusion reached. The story had spread before breakfast, had been repeated until it acquired the weight of truth. But Miss Marple, whose long experience had taught her to question the stories that fit too neatly, that required too little examination, that made everything just a bit too comfortable for everyone involved, was not quite ready to accept it. Not yet. Chapter 5. A kindness frequently remembered. The shift in conversation occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly, over the course of the next several days. What had begun as general remarks about Mr. Lennox's death evolved into something more specific, a collective remembering of Mrs. Pauline Greer's particular attentions toward him. Miss Marple first became aware of this development during a meeting of the Women's Institute, held on the Tuesday following the funeral. The gathering took place in the village hall, a draughty building that served multiple purposes and was perpetually in need of some minor repair or another. On this particular afternoon, the ladies had assembled to discuss arrangements for the Christmas bazaar, though the conversation had, as it so often did, wandered into other channels. "I must say," Mrs. Pollock remarked, setting down her teacup with a decisive click, "that Mrs. Greer was particularly good to Mr. Lennox, always making certain he knew when the show buses ran, checking that he had proper meals, that sort of thing." "Very thoughtful," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "I remember her mentioning once that she'd seen him looking tired and had suggested he might take the earlier bus home so he wouldn't be walking in full darkness." "And she was forever reminding him about the weather," added Miss Hartnell. "I heard her myself just last month telling him that rain was forecast and he ought to take an umbrella." Miss Marple, who was helping to count last year's unsold Christmas cards to determine how many new ones needed to be ordered, listened to this exchange with quiet interest. The praise being heaped upon Mrs. Greer was genuine enough, she supposed, but there was something about the timing and repetition of it that caught her attention. It was as though the village had decided, collectively and without quite articulating the decision, that Mrs. Greer's kindness needed to be established and acknowledged. Mrs. Greer herself was present at the meeting, seated near the front and making notes about the bizarre preparations with her characteristic efficiency. She had said very little during the discussion of Mr. Lennox, merely inclining her head in modest acknowledgement when her name was mentioned. But Miss Marple thought she detected a faint tension in the woman's shoulders, a slight rigidity that suggested the praise was not entirely comfortable. "It's a comfort to know he had someone looking out for him," Mrs. Price observed. "Even if he didn't have family, at least he wasn't entirely alone." "Mrs. Greer has always been wonderful about that sort of thing," another voice added. "Taking an interest in those who might otherwise be overlooked. It's a gift, really, knowing who needs help even when they don't ask for it." Miss Marple glanced up from her card counting and allowed her gaze to rest briefly on Mrs. Greer. The woman's expression remained composed, her attention apparently focused on her notes, but there was a faint colour in her cheeks that had not been there before. After the meeting concluded, Miss Marple lingered to help with tidying up, a task that several other ladies also undertook. It was during this activity that she found herself working alongside Mrs. Greer, folding away the table linens while the others carried chairs to the storage cupboard. "You must be gratified," Miss Marple said conversationally, "to know that your kindness to Mr. Lennox is so widely appreciated." Mrs. Greer's hands paused briefly in their work before resuming. "I only did what anyone would do. He was an elderly man living alone. It seemed natural to keep an eye on him. Of course, though I wonder if Mr. Lennox always welcomed such attention." The question hung in the air between them. Mrs. Greer completed folding the tablecloth she held and placed it carefully in the storage basket before responding. "I don't think I understand your meaning, Miss Marple." "Oh, only that some people, particularly those who value their independence, can find well-meant concern rather burdensome. Not that one intends it so naturally, but the effect can be the same." Mrs. Greer's grey eyes met Miss Marple's directly. "Are you suggesting that I was interfering, Miss Marple?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said mildly. "I'm merely observing that kindness can take many forms, and what feels like care to the person offering it may feel quite different to the person receiving it. Mr. Lennox never complained." "No, I don't suppose he would have. He was far too courteous for that. But then, courtesy can sometimes prevent honest communication, can't it? One smiles and thanks someone for their concern, even when one wishes simply to be left to manage one's own affairs. Mrs. Greer's expression had grown distinctly cool. "I think you're being rather uncharitable, Miss Marple. I took an interest in Mr. Lennox's welfare because I could see he needed someone to do so. If that strikes you as inappropriate, I can only say that I acted from genuine concern, not from any desire to control or interfere." "I'm sure that's true," Miss Marple replied gently, "and I hope you won't think me critical. I've simply been reflecting since Mr. Lennox's death on how we care for one another in a village like this. Sometimes our help is welcomed, and sometimes it's merely endured. The difficulty lies in knowing which is which." She moved away then, leaving Mrs. Greer to finish with the linens, and made her way home through the late afternoon dimness. The conversation had revealed more than she had anticipated, though not perhaps in the way Mrs. Greer might have realised. The defensiveness, the emphasis on genuine concern, the insistence that Mr. Lennox had never complained, all of it suggested a woman who felt her actions required justification. Over the following days, Miss Marple made it her business to inquire, in her unobtrusive way, about the nature of Mrs. Greer's relationship with Mr. Lennox. The picture that emerged was consistent. Mrs. Greer had taken him under her wing, so to speak, shortly after her own arrival in St. Mary Mead. She had introduced herself, offered assistance with practical matters, and maintained a watchful eye on his comings and goings. She was forever stopping him in the street to ask how he was managing, old Mrs. Bantry told Miss Marple one afternoon, when they happened to meet near the churchyard. Mrs. Bantry had known the village for decades and missed very little. Always very friendly about it, mind you, but persistent. I remember thinking at the time that Mr. Lennox looked rather cornered sometimes, as though he wasn't quite sure how to extract himself from the conversation. "Did he ever mention Mrs. Greer to you?" Miss Marple asked. "Once or twice. Nothing critical, just remarks about how concerned she was for his welfare. But there was a tone to it, if you know what I mean. Not quite appreciation, more like resignation, perhaps." Miss Marple did know what she meant. She had heard that particular tone herself in other contexts when people spoke of those who helped them, whether they wished for help or not. She learned from the postmistress that Mrs. Greer had been known to intercept Mr. Lennox's mail on occasion, remarking that she would save him the walk to collect it. She learned from Dr. Haydock, in passing conversation, that Mrs. Greer had once made an appointment on Mr. Lennox's behalf for what she considered a worrying cough, though Mr. Lennox had seemed both surprised and somewhat embarrassed when he arrived at the surgery. "Did he keep the appointment?" Miss Marple had asked. "Oh yes, he was far too polite to do otherwise, though there was nothing wrong with him that a bit of cold weather hadn't caused. He told me rather apologetically that Mrs. Greer had insisted, and he hadn't wanted to seem ungrateful." Each detail taken individually was entirely innocent. Mrs. Greer had been helpful, attentive, concerned. She had done exactly what many people in a village might do for an elderly neighbour living alone, and yet, accumulated together, the details painted a picture of something more comprehensive than ordinary kindness. They suggested a degree of involvement in Mr. Lennox's life that went well beyond casual concern. Miss Marple thought about this as she sat in her evening chair, her knitting providing the familiar rhythm for her thoughts. There was a type of person, she knew, who derived satisfaction from being needed, from managing the affairs of others, from knowing and directing and organising. Such people were often genuinely well-intentioned. They truly believed they were helping, and yet their help could become a sort of benevolent tyranny, subtly reshaping another person's life according to their own sense of what was appropriate or safe or best. The question that occupied Miss Marple was whether Mr. Lennox had minded. Had he been grateful, for Mrs. Greer's attention, or had he found them constraining? And if he had found them constraining, what might he have been planning to do about it? The vicar had mentioned that Mr. Lennox seemed preoccupied, had spoken of errands and personal matters to attend to. Mrs. Fletcher had heard two voices on the footpath, one of them a woman's, and Mr. Lennox had been found not on his usual route home, but on the Orchard Road in a location where he might have expected privacy. Had he been trying to avoid someone that evening? Had he taken the less direct path specifically because he did not wish to be intercepted, did not wish to be checked on, did not wish to be managed? And if so, had that someone realised what he was doing and followed? Miss Marple set down her knitting and gazed out at the dark November night. The village continued to speak warmly of Mrs. Greer's kindness to Mr. Lennox, and perhaps that kindness had been real. But Miss Marple, who understood that kindness could be complicated, that care could become control, that the best intentions could sometimes produce the most troubling results, was beginning to wonder whether it was possible to be too kind, too concerned, too helpful, whether it was possible, in short, to care for someone so thoroughly that one forgot they had the right to refuse that care. And what might happen when someone finally attempted to exercise that right? Chapter 6, What Was Quietly Redirected. The librarian at Much Benham was a Miss Violet Crane, a woman of perhaps 40 with an efficient manner and the sort of memory for faces and reading habits that made her invaluable in her profession. Miss Marple had known her slightly for some years, their paths crossing occasionally at county library committee meetings, and when she happened to have business in Much Benham the following Thursday, she made a point of stopping by the library. It was a modest building, Victorian in origin, with high windows that let in inadequate light, and a persistent smell of old paper and floor polish. Miss Crane presided over the circulation desk with the quiet authority of someone who understood that libraries were not merely repositories of books, but centres of community information. "Miss Marple, how pleasant to see you," Miss Crane said, looking up from the return she was processing. "Are you here for the committee meeting? I thought that wasn't. Until next month." "No, indeed. I'm simply in town for a few errands and thought I'd stop by. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all. It's a slow afternoon." Miss Crane set aside her work and regarded Miss Marple with the attentive expression of someone who sensed there might be purpose behind the casual visit. "I was very sorry to hear about Mr. Lennox. He was one of our most faithful patrons." "Yes, I understand he came here regularly. On Tuesdays and Fridays, wasn't it? Like clockwork. Always polite, always knew exactly what he wanted. He favoured history and biography, occasionally travel writing, a thoughtful reader." Miss Crane paused, then added, "Though I must say his habits had changed somewhat in recent weeks." Miss Marple's expression remained one of mild interest. "Changed? In what way?" "Well, he'd begun staying longer. Previously he would arrive, select his books, perhaps browse for 20 minutes or so, and then leave to catch his bus. But lately, that is, in the last month or two, he'd taken to spending an hour or more here. Sometimes he would sit at one of the reading tables with newspapers or reference books. I had the impression he was researching something." "How interesting. Did he mention what he was looking into?" Miss Crane shook her head. "He wasn't a man for conversation, as you probably know, but I couldn't help noticing he was consulting old directories, local histories, that sort of thing, materials relating to this area from 20 or 30 years ago." This was significant, Miss Marple felt, though she could not yet say precisely why. "And you say this was a recent development?" "Quite recent. It began, if I recall correctly, sometime in early October. Before that, his visits followed the same pattern they had always followed. But then something changed." Miss Crane lowered her voice slightly, though there was no one nearby to overhear. "I had the sense, Miss Marple, that he was looking for someone, or information about someone." "What gave you that impression?" "The way he examined the materials. He wasn't reading casually. He was searching for something specific, and once or twice he asked me about old parish records, voter rolls from decades past. Whether the library kept such things. We don't, of course. Those would be at the county offices, but I directed him to the proper locations." Miss Marple thanked Miss Crane and departed shortly thereafter, but her mind was occupied with this new information as she completed her errands and caught the afternoon bus back to St. Mary Mead. Mr. Lennox had been researching something, looking into the past, searching for someone or some piece of information that had suddenly become important to him, and he had begun this search approximately 6 weeks before his death. The bus deposited her at the usual stop and she made her way slowly homeward, but instead of going directly to her cottage, She found herself walking toward Marsh Lane past the church, until she reached the point where the footpath branched off toward the old orchard road. It was the route Mr. Lennox must have taken on his final evening, and Miss Marple wanted to understand why he might have chosen it. The path was narrow, bordered by hedgerows that would provide reasonable privacy from the main road. It curved gently, following the old property boundaries, and required negotiating a wooden stile that had seen better days. Beyond that, the stone wall where Mr. Lennox had been found was visible, running along the edge of what had once been a productive orchard but was now largely overgrown. As Miss Marple stood contemplating the scene, she heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the village. A moment later, Mrs. Greer appeared around the bend in the path, a shopping basket over her arm. She stopped short when she saw Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to encounter anyone out here." "No, it's not a commonly used path, is it? I was simply taking a walk and found myself curious about where Mr. Lennox was found." Mrs. Greer's expression was difficult to read. A morbid sort of curiosity, if you don't mind my saying so. "Perhaps," Miss Marple acknowledged, "though I find myself wondering why he chose to come this way. It wasn't his usual route home. I expect he simply felt like varying his walk. People do sometimes, don't they? Take a different path, see something more new." "Yes, though as I understand it, Mr. Lennox was rather a creature of habit, not much given to spontaneous variation." Mrs. Greer shifted her basket from one arm to the other. "I suppose that's true, though perhaps that's precisely why he decided to change things. Even the most habitual person can tire of the same routine." "Did he mention to you that he was considering such a change?" The question seemed to catch Mrs. Greer off guard. "Why would he mention it to me?" "Oh, only because I understand you took such a kind interest in his welfare. I thought perhaps he might have discussed his plans with you." "He did not discuss his plans with me, Miss Marple. Whatever gave you the idea that he might?" Miss Marple offered a small apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Greer, I didn't mean to imply anything inappropriate. It's simply that several people have mentioned how attentive you were to Mr. Lennox's routine, reminding him about bus times, suggesting the best routes home, that sort of thing. Naturally, I thought if he were planning to alter his habits, he might have mentioned it." Mrs. Greer's face had become quite set. "If you're asking whether I knew he intended to take the orchard path that evening, the answer is no. I had no idea where he planned to walk. It was entirely his own decision." "Of course," Miss Marple said gently, "though I wonder if he had been thinking about such changes for some time, making small adjustments to his routine, perhaps testing the waters, so to speak." "I really wouldn't know. But something interesting." Mrs. Greer's tone suggested otherwise. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime interpreting the nuances of human speech, heard defensiveness and something else. Perhaps unease, perhaps regret. They parted shortly after, Mrs. Greer continuing toward the village, and Miss Marple making her way back along the footpath. But that evening, as she sat with her knitting, Miss Marple's thoughts kept returning to the conversation. Mrs. Greer had been too quick to insist that Mr. Lennox's route that evening had been entirely his own decision, too emphatic in her denial of any knowledge about his plans. The next morning brought confirmation of what Miss Marple had begun to suspect. She encountered de Haydock while out for her morning constitutional, and after exchanging greetings, the doctor remarked, "Odd thing about Lennox. I ran into Mrs. Greer yesterday afternoon, and she mentioned that she had been worried about him taking different routes home. Said she tried to discourage it, thought it wasn't safe for a man his age to be experimenting with unfamiliar paths in the dark." "Did she indeed?" Miss Marple said. "When did these concerns arise, do you know?" "Oh, she'd mentioned it before his death, apparently. Said she'd noticed him lingering longer in Much Benham, sometimes missing his usual bus. She'd spoken to him about it, suggested he stick to his established routine. Safer that way, she felt." "And how did Mr. Lennox respond to these suggestions?" Dr. de Haydock chuckled. "Politely, I imagine. Lennox was always polite, but reading between the lines, I'd say he wasn't particularly pleased to have his movements monitored quite so closely." Miss Marple walked on, but the pieces were beginning to arrange themselves in her mind. Mr. Lennox had started to change his patterns, to stay longer in Much Benham, to research something in the library, to consider different routes home, and Mrs. Greer, who had appointed herself his guardian of sorts, had noticed these changes and had attempted to redirect him back to his established routine. Safety, Mrs. Greer had said. She believed routines kept people safe. But Miss Marple, sitting in her chair that evening and watching the darkness gather beyond her window, thought about safety and what it meant. For some people, safety meant familiarity, predictability, the comfort of knowing exactly what would happen and when. For those people, change represented danger, unpredictability, the possibility that things might slip beyond one's control. And if one had taken responsibility for managing another person's life, had appointed oneself the keeper of their welfare, had organised their existence according to one's own sense of what was appropriate and safe, then any attempt by that person to break free, to alter the patterns one had so carefully established, might feel like something that needed to be prevented. Not out of malice. Miss Marple was quite certain there had been no malice. Mrs. Greer had genuinely believed she was acting in Mr. Lennox's best interests. She had truly thought that keeping him to his routines, his safe and predictable routines, was the kindest thing she could do. But Mr. Lennox, it seemed, had been trying to reclaim his autonomy. He had been researching something, planning something, preparing to settle matters that had been left unsettled, and he had begun taking different routes, asserting his right to make his own decisions about his own life. The question was what had happened when Mrs. Greer realised she was losing control of the situation. When the person she had been so carefully managing had decided he no longer wished to be managed. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily in the quiet room. She thought about the orchard path, about the stone wall, about a conversation that Mrs. Fletcher had overheard between two people shortly before 6 o'clock on a November evening, and she thought about how safety, when defined by those who feared change most, could sometimes become the most dangerous thing of all. Chapter 7. An errand that was never completed. The information came to Miss Marple in the oblique manner that such things often did in village life, not through direct inquiry, but through the casual confluence of unrelated conversations that, when properly attended to, revealed patterns beneath the surface. She had gone to the bank in Much Benham on a Friday morning 2 weeks after Mr. Lennox's funeral to deposit a small cheque from her nephew. The bank was a stolid brick building that had occupied the same corner since Victorian times, and its interior maintained an atmosphere of hushed respectability that seemed immune to the passage of decades. Miss Marple conducted her business efficiently and was just preparing to leave when she overheard Mr. Griggs, the manager, speaking to his assistant in tones that were not quite low enough to be private. "Yes, that's the account. Lennox, Arthur, the estate solicitor, will need the final balance. Poor fellow withdrew £40 the afternoon before he died. Never had the chance to use it, I suppose. It's still on the records as a pending transaction." Miss Marple's hand paused on the door handle. £40 was not an insignificant sum, particularly for a man of Mr. Lennox's modest circumstances. It suggested purpose, a specific intention. One did not withdraw such an amount casually. She continued out into the grey November morning, but her mind had already begun to work on this new piece of information. What had Mr. Lennox intended to do with £40? And more importantly, what had become of the money? It had not been found on his person, she felt certain. Colonel Melchett would surely have mentioned it when he'd reported on the disposal of Mr. Lennox's effects. The question occupied her thoughts as she made her way to the post office, where she needed to collect a parcel. Mrs. Simpkins, who managed the Much Benham post office with considerably less efficiency than Mrs. Price managed St. Mary, Meads, was engaged in a lengthy discussion with another customer about the unreliability of postal deliveries. Miss Marple waited patiently, and when her turn finally came she collected her parcel and mentioned, as though in passing, "Such a sad business about Mr. Lennox. I understand he was here in Much Benham on the afternoon before his death." Mrs. Simpkins, who possessed that particular variety of memory that retained details without always understanding their significance, nodded vigorously. "Oh yes, indeed he was. I saw him myself, coming out of Weston's, the stationer's. He had a packet of some sort under his arm. Always very polite, Mr. Lennox. Touched his hat when he passed." "Weston's, you say? I didn't realise he had business there." "Well, I couldn't say what business it was, naturally. But he was carrying something from the shop, envelopes perhaps, or writing paper. The sort of thing one buys at a stationer's." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Simpkins and made her way back to the bus stop, but not before stopping briefly at Weston's herself. The shop was narrow and dim, lined with shelves of paper goods, pens, and the miscellaneous items that such establishments typically stocked. An elderly man behind the counter looked up as she entered. "Good morning, may I help you?" "I hope so. I'm inquiring about a friend who was a customer of yours, Mr. Arthur Lennox. I believe he made a purchase here shortly before his death." The man's expression grew thoughtful. "Lennox? Yes, I remember. He bought a large envelope, the sort used for legal documents, and he asked for sealing wax, which we don't stock much call for these days. I had to search for it in the back." "Did he mention what he needed them for?" "Not specifically, though he did say something about putting matters in order. I assumed he meant his affairs, though he didn't seem unwell or particularly concerned. Just methodical, as though he were completing a task he had been putting off." Miss Marple purchased a bulk of notepaper she didn't particularly need and returned to St. Mary Mead on the afternoon bus, her mind busy with these new details. Mr. Lennox had withdrawn £40 from the bank. He had purchased a legal-sized envelope and sealing wax. He had been researching something in the library, looking into old records and directories, and he had told the vicar he had errands to complete, personal matters to settle. These were not the actions of a man simply going about his daily routine. They were the actions of someone preparing to do something specific, something that required both money and documentation. That evening, Miss Marple invited Colonel Melchett for tea, ostensibly to discuss a matter relating to the Church Restoration Fund, but with the additional purpose of learning what she could about Mr. Lennox's personal effects. The Colonel arrived promptly at 4, bringing with him the faint scent of pipe tobacco and the brisk efficiency that characterised his approach to most matters. After they had discussed the Restoration Fund, a subject that required very little actual attention, Miss Marple turned the conversation toward Mr. Lennox. "I've been thinking about the poor man," she said, pouring tea into the Colonel's cup. "It occurred to me that there must have been various items to dispose of. His clothing, personal papers, that sort of thing." "All handled by the solicitor," Colonel Melchett confirmed. "Straightforward enough. The cottage was rented, so that simply reverted to the landlord. Personal effects were modest, some books, clothes, kitchen items, all donated to the church jumble as specified in his will." "Were there any papers, letters, documents?" The Colonel frowned slightly. "Now that you mention it, there weren't many. A few old bills, his lease agreement, that sort of thing. But nothing personal, really. No letters from family or friends. I thought it odd at the time, but then Lennox was a private man. Perhaps he didn't keep correspondence." "Or perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "he had recently sorted through such things and disposed of what he no longer needed." "Possible, I suppose. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no particular reason. I simply wondered whether there might have been anything that shed light on what he'd been doing in his final days, whether he'd mentioned plans or concerns." "Nothing of that nature. The solicitor found everything in perfect order, actually. Almost too perfect, if you know what I mean. As though Lennox had deliberately tidied everything away." After the Colonel departed, Miss Marple sat for a long while with her knitting, her needles moving in their steady rhythm, while her mind worked through the implications of what she had learned. Mr. Lennox had been preparing something. He'd gathered materials, withdrawn money, organised his affairs, and then, on the evening he had intended to complete whatever task he'd set himself, he had died on a stone wall, near the old orchard, with none of the items he'd so carefully prepared found anywhere on his person or in his cottage. The envelope, the money, whatever documents he had been carrying, all of it had vanished. The following morning, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Fletcher, the woman who lived near the Orchard Road, and who had heard voices on the evening of Mr. Lennox's death. Mrs. Fletcher was a widow in her 60s, practical and clear-headed, who kept a small market garden and was generally occupied with her own affairs rather than those of her neighbours. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," Miss Fletcher said, inviting her into a sitting room that smelled of apples and fresh bread. "I hope nothing's wrong." "Not at all. I was simply passing and thought I'd call in. I've been thinking about Mr. Lennox, and I understand you heard voices on the footpath that evening." Mrs. Fletcher nodded, settling into her chair. "Yes, though I've told the story so many times now, I'm beginning to wonder if I've remembered it correctly. It was around 6, perhaps a few minutes after. I was in the kitchen and heard talking, 2 people, I'm quite certain. One was a woman's voice, I'm sure of that. The other I couldn't make out clearly." "Were they arguing?" "No, I wouldn't say arguing exactly. The tone seemed intense, perhaps, as though they were discussing something important, but not angry, if you understand the distinction." "And how long did this conversation last?" "Not long. 5 minutes, perhaps less. Then I heard footsteps going away. Just one set, I think, back toward the village. After that, silence." Miss Marple absorbed this carefully. One set of footsteps returning to the village, which meant the other person, presumably Mr. Lennox, had remained behind, remained sitting on that wall where he would later be found. "Mrs. Fletcher, I wonder if you noticed anything else that evening? Not sounds, necessarily, but anything unusual at all?" Mrs. Fletcher thought for a moment. "Well, there was one thing, though it didn't seem significant at the time. About half an hour after I heard the voices, I happened to look out the window. I was closing the curtains, and I saw someone walking quite quickly along the footpath back toward the orchard. Just a silhouette, really. I couldn't make out who it was." "Going back?" Miss Marple said softly. "Not coming from the orchard, but returning to it?" "Yes, that's right. I remember thinking it odd, walking about in the dark like that. But then I assumed it was someone taking a shortcut home and thought no more of it." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Fletcher and made her way home slowly, her mind occupied with timelines and movements. Someone had been with Mr. Lennox shortly after 6. That person had left, returning to the village. Then half an hour later, that same person, or possibly someone else, had returned to the orchard. By which time Miss Marple thought Mr. Lennox would certainly have been dead. Someone had gone back, and when they had gone back they had taken something with them. The envelope, the money, the papers that Mr. Lennox had been carrying, the evidence of whatever errand he had been attempting to complete. Miss Marple sat in her chair that evening, watching the darkness settle over St. Mary Mead, and thought about intentions that were never fulfilled, purposes that were interrupted, errands that remained forever incomplete. Mr. Lennox had been preparing to do something, had gathered the necessary materials, had set out on what should have been a straightforward task, but someone had known what he was planning, someone had intercepted him on the orchard path. And after he was dead, that someone had returned to remove all evidence of what he had intended to do. The question was not simply what Mr. Lennox had been planning, but why someone had considered it necessary to ensure that plan was never completed, and why that person had been willing to let an elderly man die rather than allow him to finish what he had started. Chapter 8. The Choice That Looked Like Care. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the truth of a matter often revealed itself not through dramatic confrontation, but through the gradual accumulation of small certainties. One pieced together fragments, a remembered conversation here, an overheard remark there, a detail noticed, but not initially understood, until the picture emerged complete and undeniable. She had also learned that people were often more willing to speak freely when they believed themselves to be having an ordinary conversation rather than being questioned. With this in mind, she arranged what appeared to be a series of coincidental encounters over the course of the next week, each one yielding another small piece of the puzzle. From young Tom Bates, whom she met while he was making deliveries, she learned that the stone wall where Mr. Lennox had been found was visible from very few vantage points. One would have to know the Orchard Road rather well to understand that it offered privacy from the main thoroughfares while still being accessible by footpath. From the landlord of Mr. Lennox's cottage, whom she encountered in Much Benham, she learned that Mr. Lennox had recently asked about the possibility of extending his lease beyond its current annual term. He had mentioned wanting to remain in the cottage for the foreseeable future, which the landlord had taken to mean Mr. Lennox was settling in for the long term, not contemplating any immediate departure. And from Miss Crane at the library, when Miss Marple made a return visit, she learned something that cast the entire matter in a different light. "I've been thinking about Mr. Lennox since you were here last," Miss Crane said, as they stood among the biography shelves, "particularly about what he was researching. I believe I may have worked it out." "Oh?" The directories and records he was examining all dated from the late 1920s and early 30s, and they all related to this immediate area: St. Mary Mead, Much Benham, Little Stretton. He was looking for someone who had lived here during that period, and I think I know who. Miss Crane glanced around to ensure they would not be overheard, then continued in a lower voice. "About a week before his death, he asked me if I remembered a family named Greer who had lived in St. Mary Mead around 30. I told him I wouldn't have been old enough to remember. I was only a child then, but I suggested he try the parish records. He seemed very intent on finding information about them." Miss Marple felt the pieces shifting into alignment. "Greer," she said quietly. "Are you quite certain?" "Absolutely certain. The name's stuck in my mind because we have a Mrs. Greer who lives in St. Mary Mead now, don't we? I wondered at the time if there might be a connection." That evening Miss Marple sat in her chair, with her knitting untouched in her lap, and considered what she now knew, or rather, what she could reasonably infer. Mr. Lennox had been researching the Greer family from 30 years ago. He had been preparing documents, gathering money, making arrangements. He had spoken to the vicar about matters still to be settled, about decisions that others had shaped. And Mrs. Pauline Greer, who had so carefully managed his routine, who had discouraged his changes, who had insisted that safety lay in predictability, had been the last person seen with him on the evening he died. The next morning Miss Marple did something she very rarely did. She walked directly to Mrs. Greer's cottage and knocked on the door. Mrs. Greer opened it after a moment, her expression registering surprise and something else, perhaps resignation, as though she had been expecting this visit eventually. "Miss Marple, this is unexpected." "I hope I'm not intruding, Mrs. Greer. I wondered if I might have a word with you." Mrs. Greer hesitated, then stepped aside to allow Miss Marple to enter. The cottage was furnished with the sort of precise good taste that suggested someone who valued control and order. They sat in the front room, and for a moment neither spoke. Finally Miss Marple said gently, "I think you know why I've come." Mrs. Greer's hands, folded in her lap, tightened slightly. "I suppose I do. You've been making inquiries, haven't you? About Mr. Lennox, about that evening." "I have, not out of any desire to cause distress, but because I felt certain there were things about his death that had not been properly understood." "And what do you think you understand, Miss Marple?" "I understand that Mr. Lennox had discovered something about your family, that he had been researching the Greers who lived in this area 30 years ago, and I believe he had decided after all these years to take some action regarding what he had learned." Mrs. Greer's face had gone quite pale, but her composure held. "You're very perceptive. What was the connection, Mrs. Greer, between Mr. Lennox and your family?" There was a long silence. Then Mrs. Greer rose and went to a small writing desk in the corner of the room. She removed a photograph from one of the drawers and handed it to Miss Marple. It showed a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair and a gentle smile. "My older sister Margaret," Mrs. Greer said quietly. "She died in 32. She was engaged to be married, but the engagement was broken off very suddenly. 6 months later she took her own life. She was 23 years old." Miss Marple looked at the photograph with great sadness. And Mr. Lennox? Arthur Lennox was the man she was engaged to, only he wasn't called Lennox then. He used his middle name, Arthur, but his surname was Meredith. He broke off the engagement after my father objected to the match. My father was very forceful in his opinions. Arthur was a clerk, you see, and my father had ambitions for Margaret to marry better. He pressured Arthur, made it clear that engagement would not have his blessing, suggested rather strongly that Arthur should end things. And Arthur Meredith did as your father wished. Yes, he was young, uncertain, easily influenced. He ended the engagement. Margaret was devastated. She never recovered from it. And 6 months later, Mrs. Greer's voice faltered. My father died a year after that. I always believed the guilt contributed to his death, though he never acknowledged any responsibility. Miss Marple returned the photograph carefully. And when Mr. Lennox arrived in St. Mary Mead 15 years ago, you recognised him. Not immediately. He was much older, and he'd changed his name. But eventually, yes, I realised who he was. Arthur Meredith, who had let my sister down so terribly. Why did you not confront him? Mrs. Greer's smile was bitter. What would have been the point? Margaret was long dead. Confrontation wouldn't bring her back. But I found I couldn't simply ignore him either, so I did what seemed natural. I watched him. I made sure he was managing properly. I took an interest in his welfare. You controlled him, Miss Marple said softly, in the same way your father had controlled him all those years ago. Mrs. Greer's eyes flashed. I was trying to help him. Were you? Or were you ensuring that he remained exactly where you could see him, exactly within the bounds you had established? Making certain he didn't deviate from the routine you had decided was appropriate? He was an elderly man living alone. He needed someone to look after him. But he didn't want to be looked after, did he? Not in the way you were doing it. And recently he realised who you were. He worked it out, perhaps saw an old photograph or a document in his research, and understood why you had been so persistently present in his life. Mrs. Greer sat down heavily. Yes, he came to me about 6 weeks ago. He told me he had been thinking about the past, about Margaret, about the decision he had made all those years ago. He said he had always regretted it, that allowing my father to bully him had been the worst mistake of his life. He said he wanted to make amends. How did he propose to do that? He'd written something, a letter, an account of what had happened. He wanted to have it published in the local newspaper, to acknowledge publicly what he had done, to explain that Margaret's death had not been because of any failing on her part, but because he had lacked the courage to stand up to my father. He thought it would clear her name somehow, give her memory the respect she deserved. Miss Marple could picture it clearly now. Mr. Lennox, elderly and looking back on his life, wanting to set right an old wrong, wanting to take responsibility for the cowardice of his youth. And you didn't want that, she said quietly. I didn't see the point, Mrs. Greer said, her voice tight. It was 30 years ago. No one remembers anymore. Dragging it all up would only cause pain and gossip. I told him it would be better to let the past rest. But he disagreed. He was determined. He said he had spent too many years being guided by what others thought was best, that he had allowed people to shape his decisions, and he wasn't going to do that anymore. He was going to take the letter to the newspaper in Much Benham. He'd withdrawn money to pay for the advertisement space. He had everything prepared. And so you encountered him that evening, on the orchard path. Mrs. Greer's hands twisted in her lap. I'd seen him get off the bus. I knew what he was planning. He told me he was going to do it that very evening. I followed him. I thought perhaps I could reason with him one more time. I suggested we talk somewhere private. He agreed to walk with me to the orchard road. And what happened there? We talked. I pleaded with him to reconsider. He was kind but firm. He said he'd made his decision, that it was his right to make it. Then Mrs. Greer's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Then he put his hand to his chest. He said he felt strange. He sat down on the wall, very carefully. He told me to fetch Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple waited. but I could see what was happening. I could see it was his heart. And I thought, I don't know what I thought, that if help came, they might take him to hospital. He might recover, and then he'd still carry out his plan. That all the fuss and excitement would only make things worse. That the kindest thing was to let him rest quietly, to let nature take its course. He was an old man. These things happen. So you waited. I waited. I sat with him. He didn't speak much. I don't think he could. But he was conscious for a few minutes, and then he wasn't, and I realised that he was gone. And then you took the envelope, the letter he had prepared. Mrs. Greer nodded slowly. I thought it was better that way. Cleaner. No one would have to know about any of it. Mr. Sir Lennox would be remembered as a pleasant private man. Margaret's name wouldn't be dragged into the newspaper. Everything would remain peaceful. You went home, and then you returned half an hour later to collect the envelope from his coat. Yes, I couldn't take it immediately. I was too upset. But I knew I had to remove it before anyone found him. Miss Marple sat in silence for a long moment. Then she said, very gently, Mrs. Greer, do you understand what you did? I let him die peacefully, without fuss or upset. You let him die because it was convenient for you, because it solved your problem. Mr. Lennox might have been saved if you'd fetched help immediately, but you chose calm over urgency. You chose your own peace of mind over his life. Mrs. Greer's face crumpled. I didn't mean to. I thought I was being kind. He was dying anyway. Perhaps, perhaps not. We'll never know, but what we do know is that you took away his last attempt to make amends. You decided once again what was best for Arthur, Lennox, just as your father had decided for him all those years ago. Mrs. Greer wept then, quietly and without drama, and Miss Marple sat with her until the tears subsided. Chapter 9. Miss Marple puts the walk in order. The afternoon had grown late, and the light in Mrs. Greer's sitting room had taken on that particular quality of November dimness that seemed to soften edges and blur distinctions. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded over her walking stick, while Mrs. Greer composed herself. The weeping had subsided, leaving behind a sort of exhausted calm. I suppose you'll go to the police, Mrs. Greer said at length, her voice hoarse. Miss Marple considered this carefully. I think that depends on several things, Mrs. Greer. On what you understand about what happened, and on what you're prepared to do now. I don't understand what you mean. Let me explain how I came to understand the truth, Miss Marple said gently. Not through any great cleverness on my part, I assure you, but simply by paying attention to habits. You see, Mr. Lennox was a man of very fixed routines, and when those routines began to change, it told me something significant was happening. Someone who had walked the same path for years suddenly taking a different route. That wasn't random variation, that was purpose. Mrs. Greer said nothing, but she was listening intently. And then there was you, Miss Marple continued. You were so very attentive to Mr. Lennox's welfare, constantly checking on him, reminding him about buses, suggesting the safest routes. At first I thought it was simply kindness. The village certainly thought so. Everyone praised your thoughtfulness. I was trying to help him. Were you? Or were you trying to contain him? You see, Mrs. Greer, I noticed something interesting about your help. It was always directed toward keeping Mr. Lennox exactly where he was. The same routine, the same path, the same predictable pattern. You never encouraged him to try new things or meet new people. Your help was designed to maintain the status quo. Mrs. Greer's face had gone very still. I thought routines were safe for someone his age. Perhaps, but I think it was more than that. I think you needed him to stay exactly where you could see him, where you could monitor his movements, where he couldn't surprise you. Because if he strayed from the pattern, he might do something you couldn't control. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, almost conversational, but her words were precise. When I learned that Mr. Lennox had been researching old records, looking into the past, I realised he must have discovered something. And when I learned he'd been inquiring about the Greer family, I understood what that something was. He had worked out who you were, who your sister had been. He came to me, Mrs. Greer said quietly, 6 weeks ago. He told me he had been thinking about Margaret, that he'd never forgiven himself. He showed me the letter he had written. It was actually quite moving. He took full responsibility for his cowardice, explained how your father had pressured him, acknowledged that his weakness had contributed to Margaret's despair. And you asked him not to publish it. I begged him not to. I told him it would serve no purpose, that it would only rake up old pain. I said Margaret wouldn't have wanted the attention, the gossip. I reminded him that publishing such a thing might affect my own reputation in the village. People would talk about my family, about my sister's death. I asked him to consider my feelings. You asked him to do what you wanted, Miss Marple said softly, rather than what he believed was right, just as your father had asked him, all those years ago. Mrs. Greer flinched. That's not fair. Isn't it? You were asking him to remain silent, to let an injustice stand, to subordinate his conscience to your convenience. It may have been phrased differently than your father's demands, but the essential request was the same. Do what I think is best, not what you think is right. There was a long silence. Mrs. Greer stared at her hands, which were twisting a handkerchief into a tight coil. What troubled me most, Miss Marple continued, was the orchard road. Why had Mr. Lennox taken that particular path? It wasn't his usual route, and it was more difficult for a man of his age. Then I realised he was trying to avoid being intercepted. He knew you watched his movements. He knew you would try to stop him if you realised what he was doing, so he took a different path, one he thought you wouldn't anticipate. But I saw him get off the bus, Mrs. Greer whispered. I realised what evening it was. He told me he planned to do it soon. I followed him. I thought if I could just talk to him one more time, make him see reason. You thought you could manage him, just as you had been managing him all along, deciding what was best for him, what was safest, what was most appropriate. You had spent years ensuring he stayed within the boundaries you'd established, and you weren't prepared to let him step outside them now. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Greer, I need you to understand something very important. When Mr. Lennox put his hand to his chest, when he told you to fetch Dr. Haydock, what did you feel in that moment? Mrs. Greer's eyes filled with tears again. I felt panic, but also, I'm ashamed to say it, I felt relief, because I knew that if he died, the problem would be solved. The letter wouldn't be published. No one would have to know. Everything could remain as it had been. And so you chose to wait. I told myself I was being kind, that the shock and fuss of doctors and ambulances would only distress him further, that at his age, with his heart failing, the kindest thing was to let him go peacefully. I sat with him. I held his hand. I thought I was showing compassion. But you were showing yourself compassion, Mrs. Greer. You were making the choice that was easiest for you, and you were calling it kindness. Mrs. Greer buried her face in her hands. I didn't mean to let him die. I didn't plan it, but when it was happening, I couldn't make myself act. I just waited. Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle before she spoke again. The tragedy, Mrs. Greer, is that Mr. Lennox might have been saved. A prompt response, immediate medical attention, these things can make all the difference with heart conditions. Dr. Haydock would tell you as much, but we'll never know, will we? Because you chose quiet over action. You chose your own peace of mind over his life. What should I have done? Mrs. Greer's voice was anguished. After Margaret died, after my father died, I was left with all that guilt and grief, and then there was Arthur Lennox, living his comfortable retirement in the same village, apparently untouched by what had happened. Should I have simply forgotten? Pretended he bore no responsibility? You should have confronted him honestly, Miss Marple said firmly. Years ago, when you first recognised him, you should have told him who you were, told him how Margaret's death had affected you, given him the chance to acknowledge his role in what happened. That would have been honest. That would have been fair. Instead, you chose to manage him from a distance, to control his life as a form of quiet revenge, calling it care when it was really supervision. I never thought of it that way. No, I don't suppose you did. That's the insidious nature of this sort of behaviour, Mrs. Greer. We convince ourselves that we're helping, that we're acting out of concern, when in reality we're satisfying our own need for control. And when someone finally resists that control, when they assert their right to make their own decisions, we feel betrayed, as though they violated some unspoken agreement. Mrs. Greer sat very still, absorbing this. Then she said, "What happens now, Miss Marple? What do you want me to do?" Miss Marple rose slowly to her feet, gathering her walking stick and gloves. "I want you to think very carefully about what you've done. Not the letting him die, though that was wrong, gravely wrong, but the years of subtle control that preceded it. The way you appointed yourself the manager of Arthur Lennox's life without his consent. The way you mistook your own need for order and predictability for genuine care." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I'm not going to the police, Mrs. Greer. I don't believe you intended murder. You intended quiet, your own quiet at Mr. Lennox's expense. And I think you will carry the weight of that choice for the rest of your life, which is perhaps punishment enough." "But the letter!" Mrs. Greer stood abruptly. "What about the letter he wanted to publish?" Miss Marple turned back to face her. "Do you still have it?" Mrs. Greer nodded slowly. She went to the writing desk and removed an envelope from a locked drawer. She held it for a moment, then handed it to Miss Marple. "I think," Miss Marple said, weighing the envelope in her hand, "that this should be published exactly as Mr. Lennox intended. It was his last wish, his attempt to set right an old wrong. He may have been prevented from delivering it himself, but that doesn't mean his intention should be forever thwarted. The village will talk. Yes, they will. And you will have to endure that talk. You will have to live with people knowing about your sister, about your family's history, about the connection between you and Mr. Lennox. That is the consequence of what you've done, Mrs. Greer. Not legal punishment, perhaps, but social accountability." Mrs. Greer sank back into her chair. "I never wished him harm," she whispered. "I only wanted quiet." Miss Marple looked at her with something approaching pity. "Yes," she said softly, "but quiet can sometimes be the most final choice of all. The quiet you created that evening on the Orchard Road was absolute and irrevocable. And Mr. Lennox, who had finally found the courage to speak after years of silence, was silenced forever." She tucked the envelope carefully into her handbag. "I shall make sure this reaches the newspaper in much Benham. It will be published exactly as Arthur Lennox intended. It's the very least we owe him." As Miss Marple walked slowly home through the gathering dusk, she thought about the walk that had ended too soon, about the man who had tried, at last, to assert his right to make his own choices, and about the woman who had convinced herself that preventing those choices was an act of care. The truth, Miss Marple reflected, had revealed itself not through force or deceit, but through habit. By observing who adjusted routines, who decided what was best, who mistook management for mercy. It had been there all along, visible to anyone who understood how control could masquerade as kindness, how the need to manage others could disguise itself as concern for their welfare. She thought of Mr. Lennox sitting on that stone wall in the November darkness, his heart failing, knowing that help might save him, but understanding that the woman beside him had chosen not to summon it. Had he realized in those final moments that he was being managed one last time? That even his death had been decided for him? Miss Marple hoped not. She hoped he had simply felt tired, had slipped away without understanding the choice that had been made. But she would never know for certain, and that uncertainty would remain with her, as it should, as a reminder of what happened when people appointed themselves the guardians of others' lives without consent or accountability. The lights of St. Mary Mead glowed warm in the distance, and Miss Marple made her way toward them, the envelope in her handbag carrying the words of a man who had tried, too late to make amends for a lifetime of allowing others to shape his decisions. At least now, she thought, his last walk would end where he had intended it to go. Chapter 10. After the habit was broken. The letter appeared in the Much Benham Gazette 3 weeks after Miss Marple's conversation with Mrs. Greer. It was placed in the notices section, bordered in black as was customary for memorial announcements, and it read exactly as Arthur Lennox had written it 30 years after the events it described. Miss Marple read it over her morning tea, noting the clarity of expression, the dignity of the apology, the careful way Mr. Lennox had taken responsibility for his own weakness, while acknowledging the pressures that had influenced him. He wrote of Margaret Greer with tenderness and regret, of his own failure of courage, and of his belief that those who love truly deserve to be remembered with honour, rather than buried in silence and shame. It was, Miss Marple thought, a fitting last testament from a man who had finally found the strength to speak his truth. The village's reaction was complex and in its way quite revealing. Those who had known the Greer family in the 1930s were shocked and saddened, their memories stirred by names and events they had not thought of in decades. Those who had not known the family were curious and sympathetic, touched by the evident sincerity of Mr. Lennox's words. And everyone, without exception, looked at Mrs. Greer with new eyes. She did not leave St. Mary Mead, though Miss Marple suspected she had considered it. Instead, she withdrew from village life in a manner that was gradual but unmistakable. She resigned from her committees, declined invitations to gatherings, and ceased offering the helpful interventions that had once characterized her interactions with her neighbours. She could be seen occasionally in the shops or at church, always polite but no longer presumptuous, no longer assuming that her assistance would be welcome or required. The village, to its credit, did not shun her. There was talk, naturally, but it was more puzzled than cruel. People wondered why Mrs. Greer had never mentioned her connection to Mr. Lennox, why she had allowed him to live anonymously in the village without acknowledging their shared history. Some thought it admirably restrained, others found it oddly cold. But no one, Miss Marple noted, questioned the kindness Mrs. Greer had shown him. That narrative had been too thoroughly established to be easily displaced. Only Miss Marple and Mrs. Greer knew the full truth of what had happened on the Orchard Road that November evening, and by unspoken agreement they kept it between them. There had been no crime in any legal sense. Dr. Haydock had confirmed that Mr. Lennox's heart condition had been advanced, and that death, when it came, would likely have been inevitable regardless of how quickly help was summoned. What Mrs. Greer had done was wrong, certainly, but it existed in that grey space where moral failure did not quite constitute legal culpability. The punishment, such as it was, lay in Mrs. Greer's own conscience and in the subtle shift in how the village regarded her. She was no longer the capable woman who managed things efficiently. She was now someone with a complicated past, someone whose helpfulness might have been motivated by factors others could not fully understand. It was a kind of social purgatory, and Miss Marple suspected it would last for the remainder of Mrs. Greer's time in St. Mary Mead. Colonel Melchett called upon Miss Marple one afternoon in early December, ostensibly to discuss the Church Restoration Fund, but actually, Miss Marple suspected, to satisfy his curiosity about the letter that had appeared in the Gazette. "Extraordinary business," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "I had no idea Lennox had that sort of history. Makes one think, doesn't it? The lives people have lived before they arrive in a place like this." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "We rarely know the full story of anyone, however well we think we know them." Mrs. Greer must have had quite a shock seeing that letter published. Her own sister mentioned by name and everything. "I imagine it was difficult for her, yes?" The Colonel stirred his tea thoughtfully. "You know, Miss Marple, I've been thinking about Lennox's death, about the circumstances of it. It occurred to me that someone must have been with him that evening. The way he was found, sitting so composedly on that wall, it suggested he'd had time to prepare himself, perhaps had even been engaged in conversation. And Mrs. Fletcher heard voices, didn't she?" "She did," Miss Marple said calmly. "I wonder if it was Mrs. Greer he was talking to, whether she knew what he was planning to do, publishing that letter, whether she might have tried to dissuade him. It's possible, I suppose. The Colonel looked at her shrewdly. You know more than you're saying, Miss Marple. I've known you long enough to recognise that look. But I also know you well enough to trust that if there were something that needed to be brought to official attention, you would do so. You're very kind to say so, Colonel. He left shortly after, apparently satisfied that whatever had happened was being handled appropriately, even if he didn't know all the details. Miss Marple appreciated his discretion. There were some truths, she believed, that served no purpose in being fully revealed, particularly when the person most harmed was beyond the reach of justice or recompense. The Orchard Road, which had been little used before Mr. Lennox's death, and even less afterward, gradually began to see foot traffic again as winter gave way to early spring. People who had avoided it out of a vague sense of unease found that the path was actually quite pleasant when the hedgerows leafed out and the old orchard trees, though gnarled and unpruned, produced their modest blossoms. Miss Marple walked there herself one mild March afternoon, pausing at the stone wall where Mr. Lennox had been found. Someone, she suspected it might have been Mrs. Greer, had placed a small bunch of snowdrops there, tied with string. They were wilting now, but the gesture remained touching. She thought about Arthur Lennox, about Margaret Greer, about the choices people made and the consequences that rippled outward through time in ways no one could fully anticipate. She thought about the last walk home, about how it was rarely the distance that mattered, but rather all the small redirections, the gentle turnings away, the times when someone else's hand had guided the path without permission. Mr. Lennox had tried, at the end, to complete a walk he should have taken decades earlier. He had tried to reach a destination he had been turned away from in his youth, and though he had not succeeded in delivering his letter personally, the words had reached their destination anyway. The truth had been told. Margaret's name had been honoured. It was not perfect justice, it was not complete resolution, but it was, Miss Marple thought, something. It was recognition. It was acknowledgement. It was an old wrong, finally brought to light. As spring settled over St. Mary Mead, life continued in its accustomed patterns, though perhaps with a slightly greater awareness of complexity beneath the surface. Mrs. Henderson was a bit less likely to accept unsolicited advice about the best bus to catch home. Mrs. Pollock thought twice before offering to collect someone else's mail. Colonel Melchett, when he saw elderly residents walking home in the evening, sometimes offered them a lift but accepted refusal with better grace than he once had. The village had learned, without quite articulating the lesson, that helpfulness could shade into interference, that care could become control, and that the most dangerous impositions were often those that wore the mask of concern. Miss Marple, sitting in her chair by the window one April evening with her